I'll try to keep it to about 15 minutes or so in terms of the general introductory remark about China's global strategy under Xi Jinping. I will start off with a little bit of domestic politics, but then I will completely focus on the global dimension, the foreign policy dimensions of it. But it's necessary to start off with one short recapitulation of what his domestic ambition is, which is that he is doing everything he can to make China into a situation like a one country, one people, one ideology, one leader. Means that everything in China will have its resources being tapped by the Communist Party to serve the purposes for China. And that purpose is the delivery of the China dream of national rejuvenation that has to be completed by 2049 or 2050 at the latest. They use 2049 and 2050 interchangeably. 2049, of course, is the centenary of the PRC. 2050, the midpoint of the century, just to make it neat. Now, what therefore does the China dream of national rejuvenation mean? On the one hand, domestically, it meant what I already just talked about. That's part of the process, but also part of the goal. But making China one is not the end in itself. Making China one is to make China great again globally. And making China great again is being or world history. For him, it makes really no difference. Chinese history, world history, because in his understanding, and I underline that it is my understanding of his understanding, it doesn't make correct history or good history. It's bad history. It's terrible history. But in that reconstruction, times in China, when China was genuinely the greatest power in the world that was relevant to China. We're talking about the equivalent of the Qin dynasty, the Han dynasty, the Shu and the Tang and the Qing dynasty type of thing. Mongols, the Yuan, he doesn't usually talk too much about it because the Mongols is a bit too, well, the Yuan was too Mongolian for him to disguise. And for some reasons, he doesn't seem to think that the Manchus were just like the Mongols and not really very Han Chinese. But the Manchus are very good Chinese, you know. The Manchus no longer really have much of their own identity left. So they're fully integrated. Qing dynasty, therefore, is fully integrated into that conceptualization. His belief was, of course, that when China was at its zenith, it was the most rich, powerful, innovative, culture, civilized, and benevolent country in the world. So much so that countries outside of China, if they were close enough to China and were smart enough to understand what Chinese culture and civilization was, would want to borrow from China, to imitate China. For those poor ones that were a bit further away or not sufficiently civilized to really do that, at least they know to defer to China. And if everybody deferred to China, then China would not need to invade anybody. So in that conceptualization, as Xi Jinping has said time and again, China has never invaded any country. The Chinese people don't have one single imperialist gene in their gene pool. And you're talking about a civilization that developed in a small part of the Yellow River Basin, which became a continental-sized power. It's never invaded anybody. But that bad history aside, this is his understanding of it. And therefore, that restoration of this Tensha paradigm, when all under heavens understands and embrace Chinese leadership and defers to China, the world cynical. And this is good, not only for China and the Chinese, it's good for the world, it's good for everybody. If China is the global leader, China does it in the kingly way, the Wang Dao, not like the Americans who are doing it in the hegemon's way, Ba Dao. And of course, whoever takes over from America, if it happens not to be China, they will be doing it in the hegemon's ways too, because they're not sufficiently civilized to understand the kingly way. Only China can understand what the kingly way is. And only Xi Jinping among them would have the best understanding of it. Now, this is, I think, the underlying part of what the China dream is. But what is also implied in this kind of thinking, going back into Chinese history, or his understanding of Chinese history, is that he really has no intention to simply outcompete the Americans and take over hegemony from the United States in the existing liberal international order. As far as he is concerned, the liberal international order is highly problematic, even though China benefits hugely from the liberal international order. Why? Well, the liberal international order, from his perspective, is an international order created post-Second World War by the West. It is of the West and for the West. It's dominated by the small group of elitist Western capitalist countries which like to call themselves democracies and impose their norms on the rest of the world. And he said, well, this is wrong. We need to democratize that international system because the overwhelming majority of people in the world do not belong to the West, in quotation marks. And the overwhelming majority of countries in the world are also not part of the so-called democratic West. So the democratization of the international system will mean that the global South, that means all the rest of them, are the dominant part and their interests and their welfare being looked after. And above all, their right to have whatever political systems they have must be respected. That's what the Global Civilization Initiative is about. And with that support of the Global South, then China can democratize, internally transform the international system to make it into a different one which will look after the interests of the Global South, with China as the natural leader of the Global South. In other words, transform the liberal international order into the Tensha paradigm. And if that means in the process, China displaces the United States as the world's leader, that's just a necessary step that needs to be taken. And this underpins why he would claim China is not interested in Cold War 2.0. China is not interested in competing with the United States or replacing the United States. Is this a difference, a distinction without a difference, or is this a real difference? That's for you to make up your mind as to which case it is. I think you can argue equally forcibly for other, but that distinction, I think, really does matter, because if we don't make that distinction, how we engage with this challenge being posed will be different. mean, the fundamental problem with how the Americans are approaching it is that they are seeing it as China coming in to seize global leadership from the United States, replacing American hegemonism, which is less harsh than Chinese hegemony, which would be more harsh to the rest of the world, and therefore goes back all to military deterrence against China. I'll come back to all this as to whether this is a good thing or not. Now, what did Xi Jinping actually say about the world? He talks about a common destiny of the humankind. And this is what he thinks the world faces and what China will need to deliver. The common destiny of humankind. For those of you who are Mandarin speakers, then it is 人类命运共同体. That's what the original Chinese term is, 人类命运共同体. And regularly, Xinhua, Chinese government, as well as the overwhelming majority of the Western media, mistranslate that as a community of shared future. Again, if you are a Mandarin speaker, go back to the Chinese text. Where does that phrase include an element of community? It's not there. Share future? 命运 is not a share future that you choose freely to have a common future. It's a common destiny of humankind, which is inherently, potentially hierarchical rather than egalitarian, with agency of each members of the community being recognized and accepted. So it's being regularly mistranslated deliberately to project an image of Chinese benevolence and benignness, which you go back to the original isn't actually there, and goes back much more to that Tansha paradigm, because the real Tansha paradigm operated with China behaving like imperial Rome as much as imperial London, or when the Dutch Empire is, or the Spanish Empire, not all that fundamentally different in the way how the Chinese did it. The Han or your towns regularly invade its neighbors. There's nothing unusual about that. They were not doing it any more or worse than any other imperial power in human history. They were just behaving exactly the same, except that the description deliberately changed that. So you have this one side of the pivot of Chinese global strategy, which is to engage with the global South, and with the support of the global South, tries to change the international order. And if we think this Chinese talk about engaging with the global South and the language of the common destiny of humankind and the three global initiatives, the Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative, are a whole lot of ideological mumbo jumbo. Think again. You may well be, and I would say you are right to think in those terms, because they do come across as that to us. I mean, particularly when it comes down to Global Civilization Initiative, what the hell can it even mean? Now, it means a hell lot, because what it is saying is a very powerful message to autocratic leaders of autocracies in many countries in the global South. The Global Civilization Initiative is the one that underlines that every civilization is equally important and deserving of respect, and every country has the right to its own civilization, and nobody on its own or as a small group has the right to impose its own civilization on anybody else. That civilization at the core is the political system. What is being implied clearly but not spelled out is the American democracy project. Is the long-standing American commitment since the end of the Second World of making the world more democratic. That's what China says. No, 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 that's wrong. That's hegemonic. That's demeaning to other countries. That's a colonial imperialist mindset. You, friends in the global South, you have the right to treat your own people the way you see fit. You have a right to be an autocrat. It's a China given right to you. And China will protect you, will defend you. Oh, by the way, we will incidentally supplement it with the BRI. So we will lend you money at commercial rate, of course, for projects that you cannot possibly get funded by the international agencies, whether it's IMF, World Bank, ADB, or whatever. Or that if you get the loans or the development aid from European or North American countries, they will impose conditionalities that violate your China given rights to be an autocracy. We will lend you that money, but we want you to pay back. But that's beside the point. We give you the money. You can have the project. All we ask for in return, we don't ask for much in return. We don't ask you to sign off your sovereignties to us, except for one or two exceptions, like Hambantota, which was not a Chinese initiated demand to begin with. We don't ask you to sign off 99 years list of your ports and facilities. We simply say, well, for those development projects, Chinese contractors will get the lion's share, which is fair, normal, you know. The Europeans do this, the Americans do that with their projects, and support us over Taiwan, support us at the UN and other international agencies. So you write the check, somebody else paid the price, you don't have to pay it, and we write our checks back to you. What's there not to like? So the Chinese narrative actually does have a fair bit of appeal in a large part of the global South. And of course, the global South is so diverse. We can't say that the entire global South would respond to it. But that transactional nature, at least in the short to medium term, has a lot of appeal. Now, this is the first pivot. The second pivot is Taiwan. Taiwan matters hugely to Xi Jinping. The official rhetoric hasn't changed. Taiwan is all about China's national reunification, something they've been saying since the 1950s. And because it's Chinese national reunification, nobody has any right to interfere or even to comment on it. It's our domestic affairs. We don't comment about your unification. You don't comment on ours. We don't interfere with yours. You don't interfere with ours. Fair deal. Now, the big difference is that no leader of the PRC ever set a time frame for taking Taiwan back. Hu Jintao never did. Jiang Zemin never did. He said, well, it can't be indefinite. Deng Xiaoping never did. Deng Xiaoping tried to actually say, let's talk about something else. Just make sure that you accept the one China principle in general terms. You don't even have to accept our specific one China principle. You can have your one China policy, but that's good enough. That's okay. Mao did try to use force against Taiwan, but when he realized that Taiwan really wasn't too much of a problem for him after the first Taiwan Strait crisis, he was relaxed about it. He was saying that Taiwan issue, it will be resolved. Taiwan will be part of China. But it can take 100 years. It can take a couple of 100 years. It doesn't matter. There's no urgency in it. But Xi Jinping set a time frame, 2049 or 2050. Taking Taiwan is integral to the fulfillment of the China dream of national rejuvenation. Is that all because of nationalism or because Taiwan has now acquired a new geostrategic and geopolitical importance to the fulfillment of the China dream? Then we look at the reality. Now, Xi would still prefer a peaceful resolution of Taiwan. But what does that mean when he talks about a peaceful resolution of Taiwan? It means Taiwan accepts China's terms. If Taiwan accepts China's terms, then it will be entirely peaceful. But it means surrender terms. Reality in human history is that no medium power that is a genuine, vibrant democracy has ever accepted surrender terms when it is confronted with an existential threat from an external source. Sometimes they fail and get conquered, as you well know in this country. Second World War. But never accepted it simply because the threat exists. Not in particular when such a power believes that it enjoys the support of a superpower, which is what Taiwan's position is. And therefore, the reality is that no, there's no chance of Taiwan surrendering. Is Xi Jinping stupid enough to think that Taiwan will surrender? No, he's not that stupid. But if Taiwan surrender, it will still work for him, because one way or the other, when China takes Taiwan, it will be a world-changing event. China can only take Taiwan either by deterring the Americans from interfering or by inflicting sufficient losses on American forces that the Americans back off. Taiwan surrendering implies America being deterred effectively, and therefore there's no chance of American intervention, and the government in Taipei decided that negotiations would be the less damaging result. That's the only serious scenario that it can actually happen. So even in a peaceful resolution scenario, it will still have the effect of China completely discrediting the United States as the guarantor of security in the Indo-Pacific and as the upholder of the liberal international order. And that's why the change is going to be enormous. And that's why I would describe it as the second pivot of Xi Jinping's strategy for the fulfillment of the China dream of national rejuvenation. Because when that is being done, effectively, China will have secured the first island chain. The first island chain is essentially from the tip of Japan through Taiwan, right in the center of it, to the Philippines, going to the upper tip of the Indonesian archipelagos. Securing the first island chain is securing what General Douglas MacArthur in 1950 famously described as the unsinkable aircraft carrier and submarines tender, for which, if occupied in hands of powers unfriendly to the United States, would be able to disrupt American operations with its allies in the entire region. Now, the Chinese have always misquoted MacArthur and said that MacArthur intended Taiwan to be the unsinkable aircraft carrier for offensive against the Chinese. But MacArthur was always talking in the Korean War that it was an unsinkable carrier for the defense of forward defense of American position in the Asia Pacific. So the Chinese do know what MacArthur's real description of that strategic importance of Taiwan is. And if China can get hold of the first island chain, then China is in a position to project power into the second island chain, which will divide, which are basically the chains of Pacific islands that are held by the Americans, effectively dividing the Pacific Ocean into two, for which we may well have forgotten. Xi Jinping nearly openly told Barack Obama when they met in Sunnyland in 2013. And when Xi Jinping said, the Pacific Ocean is very big. It's big enough for two. Now, what he didn't say was, well, you keep to your side of the Pacific, we keep to our side of the Pacific, that'll be all right. Why would you be on our side of the Pacific anyway? We are not on your side of the Pacific. But since 2013, Xi's ambition has got much more. It's now about genuinely making China great again. This is something which we didn't see in the earlier part of the Xi Jinping decade of rule. The ambition, he was always ambitious, but the scale of their ambition got bigger and bigger as he stayed on in power for longer and longer. So this is where we are dealing with in terms of what we are. I can continue to talk about what we should do, but I think I'll probably leave that for the moment and we have that in our conversation.
You kept us all spellbound. That was there's lots to unpack there, I think, and we will open the floor for questions in a minute. But first, I'd like to invite Professor Florian Schneider of Leiden University to come and deliver his comments. He's professor. Quick introduction of modern China and his research interests include political communication and international relations, amongst many, many others, such as drawing as well, by the way. Not related. So thank you. And Florian Schneider is also the academic director of the Leiden Asia Center. So very pleased to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Floris. I'm just going to move this around so that the camera folks don't just look at the back of my pad. Welcome everyone at home and welcome to all of you. Thanks for having me and giving me the chance to talk a little bit about Steve's fantastic book. Not just Steve, also Olivia Tsang, who's the collaborator on this project. One of the things that I very much appreciate in your work is how detail-oriented it is. I think we need more people who actually look at what's getting said. And you gave us a little bit of an impression of why it matters to actually speak Chinese. It's okay if you don't, but it might be wise to sometimes ask some folks who actually speak Chinese of what's really going on, because otherwise we might just be missing important nuances. And words matter, right? And clearly they matter to the Chinese Communist Party. So that's something that I always very much liked about your analyses, and that's also very evident here. I also found it very interesting how in the book you describe Xi Jinping as the ultimate Leninist. And so this is someone who really believes in the power of the Communist Party, as believes in the idea of one-party rule, but also as a tool for getting things done. And that sets him fundamentally apart from, for example, Mao Zedong. And we see so much comparison between Xi and Mao in popular discussions, and it's not very helpful because that's not what's happening. And I think you make a very strong point in showing us why. What is different about Xi Jinping? And you also have a very good point, I think, about how Xi is using almost cherry picking from the supermarket of ideologies, including the Chinese past. You get little bits and pieces of Confucianism, then you get some bits and pieces from Mao, from foreign affairs and ideas, all sort of mashed together to make Xi Jinping fall, but often misrepresenting what the originals were really about. Because, yeah, I think you mentioned on a couple of occasions that Confucius would be turning in his grave if he knew what the Communist Party is doing with Confucianism these days. I found all of that intriguing, just as I find it really quite intriguing how there's quite a few continuities to previous administrations. The road to revival is not an idea that Xi Jinping came up with. Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao were all about Fu Xing Zhi Lu, right? Road to revival. And yet we have this rupture where Xi Jinping is pretending that the Hu Wen administration basically doesn't exist, and everything is his making. So I find that quite intriguing. I also wonder what ruptures we will now be seeing or have already a hint of, considering this idea of potentially taking Taiwan back with military force, but then being confronted with the realities of what happens when you launch a war against a democratic country, which is what we saw with Russia. And so Xi Jinping must have learned a lesson or two about what can actually be done. I think one of your conclusions is that the economic fallout of such an event is so massive that the Chinese Communist Party has to be very seriously worried of what would happen if the PRC really did invade Taiwan. A couple of thoughts and maybe open questions that I had. You mentioned the Tianxia paradigm, which is also something that a lot of Chinese international relations scholars have been pushing as a way for us to understand what China is all about. There's a lot of inaccuracies in that. The historical record does not show the kind of benevolence that people keep harping on about. But it is in a way an ambition, which is quite interesting. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I'm wondering, how successful is it to use the rhetoric of Tianxia and benevolence towards partners in the global south, for instance, considering that those alliances aren't really about the Tianxia kingly way idea, because that would be, you're demonstrating your benevolence and your value system so eloquently and so well that people will want to follow you. And one of the reasons why I think so many scholars and politicians in China like the soft power idea, because I think, if only people really understand the real China, right, then they will follow us and we don't need to pay them off or force them. But much of what you've now described is that people are getting paid off. Right? It's about money. And as long as you keep the money flowing, yeah, sure, folks will support you in the, I don't know, in the UN, for instance. But once the money stops flowing, will that still be the case? Are values really getting aligned? I'm not so sure. Another open question I had was making sense of Chinese politics by looking at Xi Jinping. You've made a very strong case of why we need to care about Xi Jinping thought, but it's not just Xi Jinping who's inventing all of these things. A lot of that ideology comes from a person called Wang Huning. I don't know if you're familiar, but it's one of the big people who's been developing ideology for decades now, so since Jiang Zemin, really. And it's not just him either. There's a whole team of people in the background who will keep tweaking the ideology and making this stuff happen. And I'm curious to hear, how much does Xi Jinping really feature into these construction processes? How much is this a bureaucratic endeavor where Xi Jinping has been moved to the fore by the Communist Party, by the leadership, by a whole bunch of people who benefit from having him there, rather than just his personal ambitions? How do these two things kind of combine, personal ambitions and bureaucratic politics? Especially considering how Chinese politics can be quite fragmented. I suspect that there's folks in, I don't know, Shanghai, Zhejiang, Jiangsu, who have a very different understanding of what the China dream is or what harmony means and so on. And they each tweak their own policies within that framework, but sometimes folks in Shanghai might have a very different take than folks in Beijing, but they all use similar language and just kind of move things along. So how should we make sense of these contrasts that sometimes emerge? And then my final issues or questions, maybe something we can discuss here, is about what should we do, right? What should people in Europe do? You mentioned economic leverage matters in your book, that by demonstrating, especially in the wake of the Russian war, how painful it would be to make the wrong policy decisions on the international stage, how European companies and governments might react in order to damage Chinese economic progress, that would be a very strong point of leverage. I'm inclined to agree. But there are potential other things that Europeans might want to think about. One is that this whole Tianxia benevolence idea is also a commitment on the Chinese side to a particular kind of rhetoric. And I'm wondering, what's the potential for Europeans also working with Chinese partners to use that discourse, right, that language, the concepts, and infuse it with somewhat different meanings, move it away from the more authoritarian understandings, and potentially try and create the type of rhetorical trap that politicians then have a very hard time moving away from. That's kind of what happened in the European Union, and why we have the European Union, because European politicians kept talking about unity to the point that they couldn't pedal back at some point and were committed, even if it didn't serve their national interest. Is there an opportunity like that in the Chinese case as well, considering how much the language matters? And then I'm also wondering what Europe might have to do to demonstrate its own value system. because you mentioned that the Americans insist on democracy on the international stage, but international politics isn't democratic, right? We can argue whether America is or whether Europe is, but definitely the international stage, not all that democratic. And that makes it seem quite hypocritical when Europeans or Americans say, we all stand for democracy. We might want to, but it's an easy sell for the Communist Party towards the global South to say, look at these hypocrites, right? They're not really standing in for what they're preaching. What can Europe or America do better in order to really strengthen these arguments and not seem hypocritical and not be vulnerable to these attacks by Chinese rhetoric, for instance? So that's just a couple of thoughts I had, and you can decide what you want to respond to, I suppose. And then we'll open it up to discussion. By the way, quick comment, we are working under Chatham House rules. I think everyone knows what that means, but in case you don't, so you can mention what gets said here, but not attribute it to anyone in the room, so that we can have a really frank, open discussion and no one feels worried about what they want to say here. You're not on the record, right? So thank you very much. These are my
Slight readjustment here, and I'm already worried that we will not. I mean, officially this is supposed to last an hour, but I fear that there may not be enough time. I don't mind going over time a little bit, but if you need to leave early, then by all means, just try to leave the room, and that'll be that. But I don't want to leave anything unsaid, so to speak. Then maybe I should adjust this one as well. Maybe the last point you raised is quite nice for you to respond to, Tsang, considering Xi Jinping is starting a European tour next week.
Sure.
Yeah, what should the European response be?
If I may, actually quite like to respond to all 3 points that the point 1 and point 3 are very closely related. Point 2 is actually a very interesting methodological side of it, the Wang Huning side of the story. You're completely right. Wang Huning and his team are more responsible for pending most of the speeches and documents issued in the name of Xi Jinping that we read as part of the political thought of Xi Jinping. And you're completely right there. Now, where I am completely relaxed about that, not seeing it as a structural Communist Party position that is confining and guiding Xi Jinping, is that Wang Huning is somebody who started off picked up by Jiang Zemin from Fudan to be his advisor on general political theoretical dimension, then served loyally to Hu Jintao for another 10 years, and then served Xi Jinping for over 10 years. If one could be politically extremely incorrect, he is an incredibly capable political dog. He barks because he knows the boss wants him to bark in a particular way, and he changes his bark with a change of political leadership. He writes what Xi Jinping wants him to write. And therefore, what is being codified and issued in Xi Jinping's name are all something that Xi Jinping himself has seen, approved of, and therefore does represent Xi Jinping's idea, rather than Xi Jinping just going along with it because somebody else has come up with some good idea. Even the language that is being used represents close to Xi Jinping's own writing, which is why it is so incredibly difficult to read, because the man can't write. Not like Mao Zedong. I mean, if you read Mao Zedong's text in original, he actually wrote beautifully in Chinese. Documents issued in Xi Jinping's name, Jesus Christ, how Now, to going back to the point about the strengths and weaknesses of China's appeal to the global South, and therefore how we should respond, I think they really, in a sense, are very closely related. And what I would say is that in Xi Jinping thought itself, it has its own seed of destruction. Because what is also implicit in Xi Jinping's approach to the global South and global affairs is that he is putting China first. That fundamentally transactional nature of his approach is something which will, over the longer term, undermine him. But in the short to medium term, that transaction works. I mean, we have seen how that BRI transformed in the last 10 years from being very expensive and pretty uncoordinated to something that is much more coordinated, much tighter, and much more sustainable now because money is getting tighter, which also means that it is actually less attractive for the recipient at the other end of it. So if we allow Xi to reveal that fundamental transitional nature and Sinocentric approach of his approach, the level of support he can get in the global south would probably weaken over time, but we're not there yet. And that raises the second question, which is what we should do about it. I think what we should do about it includes two elements. I think Taiwan does matter hugely. Coming up with an effective way to deter Xi Jinping over Taiwan is something we must do. And that deterrence cannot be by conventional military deterrence. Not because Europe and America cannot come up with an effective military deterrence in a conventional way. We can. We have the capacity to build that up. We just take time and investment. But even if we build up that capability, it's not going to work. Deterrence doesn't work when the ones to deter has built up the capabilities. Deterrence works when the one who needs to be deterred understands the deterrence and is willing to act on it. Here we get into the fundamental problem with the changes in the way how the Chinese political system works under Xi Jinping. Before Xi Jinping, or up to the earlier part of Xi Jinping's first term, there was still collective leadership in the Communist Party, and certainly from since after 1989, 1990, Beijing, the Tiananmen massacre, the Communist Party upper echelon steadily increased the scope of internal policy debates. That means people within the top echelon were able to openly disagree and test ideas out. That's completely put to an end by 2017, 2018. Now, the top echelon is a complete echo chamber. Xi had created a situation that in the Central Military Commission, if he says, we are going to invade Taiwan, you will have no general or admiral who will dare to say that, sir, I think we might need another 5 years preparation. You say that, you are immediately in trouble. You go to war and lose it, you may pin the blame on somebody else. And you may not actually lose anyway. War is a funny thing. So there's no scope for the senior professional military leaders in China to act, to advise the top leader to act on military deterrence of the United States. And Xi, for all his claims of his special relationship with the PLA, doesn't understand a thing about military. So that military deterrence doesn't work. The only deterrence work is if Europe and America, plus a couple of other major democratic economies like Japan and South Korea and Australia, all collectively are able to say, when China is preparing for an attack on Taiwan, that please don't do it, because if you did, we will cut off our economic relationship with you. We know if we do that, we are going to lose 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% of our GDP, depending on which country it is. But that's incredibly painful, but just about what we can politically survive. We end up in a war, we are going to talk about an economic devastation is much greater than that. But at the same time, with the loss of that economic relationship with us, your economy will be completely toast. And if the Chinese economy totally collapses, even Xi Jinping understands instinctively, then he will have an enormous problem keeping the Communist Party and him in power. And the risk of the Communist Party then turning against him to get rid of him to save the Communist Party in power is a very high risk. And that's one thing he will immediately respond and react and not allow that to happen. Delivering the China dream is a desirable, it's what he wants to do. That's what he's committed to do. But keeping Xi Jinping in power is an absolute total necessity. That's what we need to do. You can throw in additional things to with the deterrence that if you do that, we will all immediately recognize Taiwan and establish the diplomatic relations with Taiwan. I mean, I don't think that really matters that terribly much to Xi Jinping, quite frankly. But the economic devastations would be. And it is not exclusive to the military deterrence idea. The point really is that military deterrence cannot on its own work. Military deterrence needs to be thought of in a different way, which is that if the economic deterrence doesn't work, that is a fallback position. Because if we don't build up the capabilities, we are going to be in an incredibly difficult situation there. And the other side of that thing we need to do is to engage in a beauty contest with China in reaching out to and engaging with the global south. Europe is actually in a better position than the United States in a sense, in that for all the problem of the colonial history we have in Africa and elsewhere, we are willing to acknowledge that imperial past and the wrongs that have been done to different parts of the world. It goes some way in addressing the kind of concern that some of the countries in the global south have against us. The Americans' denial of America could ever be imperialist actually doesn't go down quite so well, because reality is America behaved like an imperial power too, less brutal than European colonialism of the 19th century, but the receiving end, that marginal difference really doesn't amount to very much. So there is things that we can do in how we actually engage with the global south, which will then show up that what Xi Jinping promises are empty promises and not true. And we'll have to engage it as a beauty contest rather than a competition. So that at the receiving end, they will be able to see that actually working with us is in their interest rather than not.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your response.